This documentary is about a tragic and avoidable accident in which Brian Bugge'in, a student on a technical diver training course, entered the water without his equipment configured correctly and subsequently drowned. It is told through the lens of human factors and just culture, concepts which are lacking in many industries, including the diving industry. Since 2011, I've been applying these concepts to diving based on my previous military aviation experience and a research project that started in 2012. I've had the privilege of working with Ashley, Brian's widow, and the dive team for the last 6 months to tell their story. A story which is made up of numerous mistakes, problems and violations, many of which started before the 20th of May. For the viewer, these issues will be highlighted as captions, and as we apply hindsight, you will come to see which factors are important and relevant, and crucially, you will have a clarity which those at the time did not have. We cannot predict the future with 100% accuracy, but we can learn from others' mistakes to improve our own safety.
Brian died because he forgot to turn his oxygen tank back on. His brain needed oxygen it just didn't have. He became hypoxic and lost consciousness minutes after jumping into the water. He drowned, sinking to the ocean floor, his instructor and classmates just feet away.
This was one moment, a single mistake that anybody could have made, and many have, but have survived. This dive was different because all of the negative factors came together just at the right time and created something which wasn't survivable. In the same way that an orchestra can play perfect notes in a random order and not produce a fine symphony, when those same notes are played perfectly but in the right order, we get beautiful music which resonates with us. We need to look at that human element and how accidents really happen, not just focus on the obvious errors or violations closer to the fatality or the serious injury.
Brian was a father to our 3 children. He was my husband, my best friend, my diving partner, an officer in the Navy, and really an adventurer through and through. His excitement and wanderlust nature started very young, from a very young age, really with this idea of scuba diving and of seeing the ocean and seeing the world, a part of the world that not everybody gets the opportunity to see. He was out here working, and my daughter and I flew out to see him for a weekend while he was working, and he surprised me with a Discover Scuba Dive adventure for the day. And so we got geared up, we got out on our boat. There were 2 other people with us on the diving boat, and we jumped in the water, first time in the water, went down the chain, started doing our drills, and our dive master was with us and noticed after the other 2 came in that they were struggling. They couldn't really get down the chain, they couldn't clear, they couldn't perform their drills. So he brought Brian and I down to the bottom of the ocean, and we kneeled down there, and the other 2 were struggling, and our dive master looked at us and said, "Okay, wait here, boat." And Brian and I, for probably 5 to 10 minutes, just sat on the bottom of the ocean floor, just completely amazed. We just knew that moment going forward, that diving would be a part of us as individuals, as part of our relationship, and really just, it had changed our lives. We were certified basic open water divers on January 1st, 2015, and we had pre-booked dives ahead of time with this dive shop we knew we were going to get certified, and we pre-booked a few dives after that. And the first one was on New Year's Day. We had booked a dive through the cenotes. And when our dive master, who was also our instructor, met us that morning on the drive out, he said, really, this is an advanced dive. You guys really probably shouldn't be doing this as brand new open water divers. But, I'm the one that certified you, and I think that you guys are okay enough to dive these. So shame on the shop, but you guys are okay. And we thought, okay. And so we spent New Year's Day diving through the cenotes for our very first few dives as certified divers.
Right from the outset, Brian was exposed to gaps in the safety systems and violations within the diving industry. But he didn't know what he didn't know.
Now, within the safety industry, high-risk safety industries, they focus on these gaps because that's where safety is compromised and risk is introduced. But they don't just focus at the individual level, they focus at the organizational, supervisory levels too, because they recognize that this can cascade down to the sharp end. Now, Professor James Reason created this framework, the Swiss cheese model, which addresses organizational, supervisory, and individual failures. Each of those levels has got defenses in them, but because they're designed and operated by humans, they've got holes in them. And it is when these holes line up that we end up with accidents occurring. Now, this is a really simplistic model and assumes a sort of linear cause and effect. The real world, as you'll see from this documentary, is far more complex than that.
Okay, so I joined the program with the CCR in early February 2018.
I began my training to become a scuba instructor, learned about the dive industry and how everyone depends on each other as a team to accomplish a goal.
He really, really wanted to push himself. He knew diving was a big part of him at that point. And he started to research different diving opportunities. And through that, he had found this closed circuit rebreather course available through one of the shops on the island. And he found that because he'd been a military veteran, he would be able to use his GI benefits to take this course, take many courses. He looked as far into the future as he possibly could. And soon he was basically selling me this dream of I could be a dive master on this rebreather, we could travel the world with it, I can teach diving, I think I can do this, I know I can do this, and it soon became all-consuming. He just wanted to dive. He wanted to dive with the best of the best.
So I first met Brian when I started the class, and in this terms, right, when we talked about the class, it was an academy type setting, so it was multiple dive classes that we had signed up for in kind of a series. And that night, right away, kind of started like some of the frustration about like some of the organization of the program we had entered into.
It was a kind of a very different program than what I was used to, in a sense where the schedule was not set. The training classes were very fluid and constantly changing. It was very challenging for me to find time set aside that I was expecting versus what was being met.
Yeah, he started this class, and really right from the get-go, it was not exactly what he thought it would be. He was very used to a very regimented schedule, a very regimented way of doing things, and he signed up for this class with a set schedule in mind, a set schedule that they had given him, and that very first class that he was scheduled to take got rescheduled. It got rescheduled again, a third time, and I believe a fourth time. You know, but he was so excited. He had blinders on. He was so excited about this class and that it was going to be free to him because he was using his military benefits. By that time, he did have frustrations with the shop, with the school. He did have frustrations with his instructor. If you schedule the course, then you make it happen, because that was very much his personality of making things happen for himself. And in this scenario, he couldn't, because there was a chain of command in the setting, and he needed to follow that just as he'd been taught, and his co-students had been taught through their military service.
We fast forward to the week before the event. Brian and I had quite a number of discussions about I don't want to say the urgency to get it done, but when we enrolled in the program, it was supposed to be 22 weeks, and it was paid for with the VA GI Bill, which meant that there were requirements.
Course date was set, and right up until the week prior, there had been some friction at the school between the instructor, between the students, between other instructors, There was a lot of interpersonal dialogue going on where people weren't happy. All of the schedule changes, all of the pressure, the course date had come to an end and they were now past when they were supposed to have done it. There was a lot of stuff going on and a lot of people upset, Brian included.
Tuesday before our dive, we had a group and an instructor that was supposed to be carrying out our dive, and some things came into play and he backed out of the dive completely. So we ended up 2 days before the actual dive itself with a totally new instructor to me, an instructor that the other 3 divers had already been in play with and had done multiple dives with.
As you'll have started to recognise now, there are a number of factors that are starting to influence behaviours. These are error-producing conditions or performance-shaping factors, and this could be time schedule changes, difference of opinion about how training courses should be taught, the frustration that was just starting to get into the programme. Within the high-risk industries, the nuclear industry created this framework called the WITH model or the twin model, which looks at the workplace, the individual, the task at hand, and human susceptibility or fallibility. And this framework is really worth looking at when we come to accidents or incidents. Look at the error-producing conditions because they will start to influence the performance of the operators or the divers.
When we got to the Thursday night session of sitting down and planning our gases, we sat down and we all coordinated on what gases would be set for the dive, who would be carrying what mixes, and everybody's separate bailouts and everything that was going on.
The weekend that they were supposed to dive a Saturday and a Sunday. Friday night, Brian came to me and said, "I'm so sorry, I know we were supposed to, we had family plans this weekend, but now the schedule has changed again, and now we're not going to be diving tomorrow, we're going to be diving Sunday. Is that okay?"
It was definitely a lot of like frustration and anger and kind of bitter, like resent about how the whole thing had been going together. And it was just really the culmination of the whole program just being so poorly organized, let alone the quality of the training, good, bad, or indifferent.
2-3 months of this now, and it was getting very frustrating. And he came to me this night, the night before the dive, and said, "I'm so sorry. I know that this is frustrating. I know that this is taking its toll on us as a family. I know it's taking its toll on you, on the kids. You're pregnant. There's all of these things going on. I think I just need to cancel. I think I just need to step out of this class. I think I need to just rethink this and maybe come back to it when it's more convenient for us as a family." And I asked him if that's what he wanted, if he really wanted to quit the class, if that was even an option, knowing that the interpersonal situation at the shop didn't lead anybody to believe that that would be an option, to even quit the class. And he said, "Yeah, this is really hard on you guys. This is really hard on us as a family. And I'm really sorry." And I looked him in the eyes and I told him to just do it. I told him I know he didn't really want to quit the class, that he was more concerned about how this was affecting the kids and I, and that this wasn't about the kids' night, it was about him and this opportunity for him. And that he just needed to power through, that we would be fine, we would figure it out, and that he just needed to power through this class. This was the last class, the last dive that he needed to do to finish this class. And I told him he had my support and that he should finish it. He said, okay, thank you for being so supportive. I don't know how I got so lucky to have you as my wife. This is something I see for us. I see it for our future. This is something that I can do, that we can do as a family. And the next morning, he left for that dive and he didn't come home.
It is now the 20th of May, the day Brian died. As we can see from the dive team, there have been numerous factors that are starting to come together, but importantly, each on their own is not really a critical issue.
So when we got in the next morning, we had already, during our planning on Thursday, when we got in on Saturday morning, we had already done our planning to what gases we were, so we all had to change that. I had paper copies and I handed out all the dive plans and the mixes, and so there's like a lot of changes were going on in this short period of time.
Ultimately, we got all our gases together, and Brian seemed like really perturbed with the whole thing as we were like meeting to analyze gas and finalize plans based on actual analyzed gas mixes versus what we planned.
When we actually got on the boat, I remember setting my gear up, the other 3 divers on the other side, and then 2 other divers on the boat. And I'd like to say it was controlled chaos, but probably not.
Sunday morning, when I arrived at the boat, I think it was like a 7 o'clock meet with the idea the boat left at 7:30. And I got there just before 7. And Brian was already on the boat, which was really atypical. Basically ready to go. I think he even had his dry suit on, or he certainly had his undergarments on and was putting his dry suit on when I got there.
We were scheduled to dive on the Sea Tiger, and it was a morning dive, and we met at the marina in Kiawala Basin, and we loaded the boat with our gear, and we got everything ready, and we departed the harbor.
The instructor's attitude and the way he had been doing things wasn't as, like my first instructor was very inactive, not so much controlling, but in the game and talking to us, and had more of a factor of, hey, this is my game and this is how we're doing it, and these are the things that need to be expected. And I think he kind of took it as that, you know, everybody's been doing this for a while. Either you were a prior instructor in a different level of diving, and so he kind of was on the outskirts. We were all just like buddies on this dive, more so than an instructor and 4 divers on their final training dive.
Like, I was putting on my wetsuit and other divers getting ready. Brian made a comment like, hey, let's go guys, you know, the dry suit clock is ticking, because it was warm. It's, you know, May in Hawaii.
So we sat down on the boat, and I was on one side of the boat, and Brian and John and Tim were on the other side of the boat with the instructor next to me. And we started gearing up, and Brian had a whole bunch of gear on with him, including his dry suit, and then he had a camera that he was taking in the water.
And then on the way out to the dive site, it's a short trip, maybe 8 minutes, something like that. He was doing the pre-breathe on his unit. And I think I did mine before we left. I don't remember exactly when I did it now, but I remember seeing him do it, and I remember like checklists and like procedures for doing preparing his gear was like something that was almost like religious to him. It wasn't atypical for me to see him do it. I mean, it was never something that we explicitly talked about. Like, did you do your checklist? Like, I'd see him do it. I knew he was doing it. And if he was doing part of it, I knew that had to have meant he did all of it.
I am pretty meticulous type person, and I don't like to feel rushed. So I take my time and typically I found that that was meaning that I was the last one in the water every time, and sometimes they might even be waiting for me to get in. But I found that I didn't want to rush because there's so many things involved in a rebreather that if you rush, you could miss something, and it can be a problem.
Brian was the first one off of the boat. He got off of the boat. The instructor followed him off of the boat.
And I remember as I was gearing up, seeing Brian respond to the instructor asked him if there was much current, and he said a little bit. And then someone asked him if he wanted his camera, and he said no, not yet. And Brian and I had talked about it either the night before or 2 nights before. He had asked me if I was going to bring my camera, and I said no. I had pretty strong feelings against having a camera while we were in a training environment. And he said, well, it's a dive site we've been to. In fact, we had just dove there 3 or 4 days before that, at night even. And so it was a dive site we've been to, we were really familiar with. The depths involved wasn't a significant change compared to what we were already diving. So he just felt like it wasn't a big deal to have the camera. And on top of it, he was the marketing manager or something to that effect at the dive shop. And so I think he felt some pressure to generate media, although I don't think that there was any pressure to explicitly generate media from that dive.
So with all of the anxiety that I was having and going on, there's an expectation that your instructor knows these things, that your other students who are also professionals know these things, and maybe it was just me, and kind of like speaking out and saying, hey, are we really doing this right? Probably wasn't the right forum for me to do it. I kind of felt that it wasn't right, the place at that time, that maybe I should speak up, and that maybe after the fact it's something that I could talk to them, instead of speaking up at the time when you really, in your heart and your soul, that they're probably going wrong. And I did not speak up when the time was probably presented. And then after the instructor, Tim, got in, and it was kind of like a current, and Tim kind of grabbed a hold of the tagline. So he was back behind the boat with the current, and when I went in, I went immediately to the side of the boat.
Because of the current, as I was putting one cylinder on, I'm drifting down the tagline, and I reached the end of it, so I pull myself back up to the boat and get the other one. I thought the current was pretty strong. I mean, certainly not the strongest current that I've ever dove in, and certainly not as strong as some places in the world that are really known for strong currents.
Just about the time that I was ready to go and was just about to stand up, I heard the instructor yelling that we needed to get the boat over to him.
At this point here, looking at the data from the rebreather controller, we can see that the oxygen levels within the breathing loop are down below levels that are life-sustaining, and it appears that Brian has passed out due to hypoxia and is now sinking.
Got off of the mooring on the Sea Tiger and made our way as quickly as we could to who I didn't know at the time was Brian. The instructor, as soon as we got close, said that get your fins on, I need some help, in the water. So I quickly put my fins on and jumped in the water and swam to the instructor and the other diver, which I quickly learned that it was Brian. But once we got his gear off, we quickly moved him onto the boat, and I began giving him CPR.
Whilst John and the other members on the boat were performing CPR on Brian, they were heading back into the dockside, and it took a number of them to get Brian off of the boat and into an ambulance that had been called, and unfortunately Brian was then pronounced dead at the hospital.
In Brian's case, we know he became hypoxic. Why? His oxygen cylinder wasn't turned back on, and his handset was set to surface mode. He was task-loaded and distracted. Why? Internal pressure to capture footage of the class on his new camera. Family and self-pressures to finish the course and be done with it. Physiological factors of sitting in a dry suit in the hot Hawaiian sun and the need to be in the water first. His instructor not alert to the fact his checks hadn't been completed properly and no system of buddy checks. Perceived time pressures and frustrations. Not letting the team down to keep things moving along. Classroom training in which he was taught to turn his O2 off during boat rides to preserve gas. And so the list goes on. Any single one of these, on their own, are not typically a grave error. But when happening in succession and without a safe environment to learn in, we now know they can have fatal consequences.
So hindsight makes things so much easier to spot failures that should have or could have been corrected. Brian should not have entered the water with his equipment configured in the way he did. The instructor should have delivered a more effective class in terms of content and schedule. The dive team should have been able to speak up about their concerns. The pressures that the team were under shouldn't have been there. The problem with these counterfactuals is that they tell a story which did not exist. Sidney Dekker, a world-class expert on human error and just culture, describes hindsight as analogous to being in a tube or a tunnel with multiple branches. Those inside can only see the inside of the tube and cannot see the end. But those outside who are looking in, informed by hindsight, can see which paths end up in success and which end up in disaster. It would be easy to identify critical factors which led to Brian's death, like the oxygen not being turned back on, the number of units, the number of hours on the unit being less than the standards required, the standards themselves not being easily understood or accessible, the rebreather configuration not being standard, that a checklist wasn't executed properly, that the instructor was not paying the right amount of attention to the task at hand. As observers after the fact, we need to bear in mind that we know what the outcome is with 100% certainty, something that Brian, the instructor, and the others in the team did not. Our lives are full of multiple, interdependent decisions as we try to navigate the complex interactions with multiple competing goals, from peer pressure, financial pressure, organizational pressure, and time pressures. That same applies to diving and diving instruction. Which instructor do we choose? Which dive center? What equipment? The locations and times we have available to undertake the dives and the training. Most of the time, those trade-offs are validated because we don't have an adverse outcome, but we need to be careful that just because we didn't have something go wrong when we drift, that we weren't doing something suboptimal. For example, numerous rebreather divers have entered the water without their diluent and/or oxygen cylinders turned on, and they did not die. And as such, we can't say that entering the water with them turned off will end up in a fatality. Accidents happen because of surprises, and surprises come from something being different to normal. If we want to understand how diving accidents and near misses occur, we need to look at what normal diving looks like and the deviations from that, not just the deviations from the rules and the standards which should have been applied. For example, the dive team came from military backgrounds, which meant it was much harder to challenge authority because of social rules, rules regarding social conformance. In addition, because the instructor had created an environment through the phrase, out of professional courtesy, with those students who were diving professionals in their own right. This caused problems because when lessons were delivered without complete information, and so effective learning didn't happen, those students didn't want to look stupid in front of their peers for not knowing something. The effect was that everyone had a lower level of knowledge than they should have. Exam tests should have covered this until you realized that the grading scores were provided during the exams. To be able to tell stories about what normal looks like, we have to have a just culture in place. A just culture is the recognition that we're all fallible, irrespective of experience and qualification, and that we should look at the local rationality of those involved, because no one gets up in the morning planning to die, to injure someone, to break some equipment. Ultimately, it must have made sense to do what they did. However, a just culture isn't the same as a no-blame culture, because willful negligence, sabotage and violations for personal gain should be punished. Again, Sidney Dekker highlighted that it isn't so much as where the line of acceptability is drawn, but rather who draws the line. In diving, there is a constant fear of litigation. As such, it is the lawyers who normally draw the line. In cases where litigation is not involved, such as near misses or minor incidents, it is social media and our peers who are drawing the line, mostly without understanding the local rationality because they don't have the context. Brian made mistakes, his instructor made mistakes, the team made mistakes. The significance of those mistakes was not known until after the event. However, they all provide opportunities for learning, but only if the story is told. Importantly, telling the story can only happen if the environment is psychologically safe and the community recognizes the prevalence of human error and why errors happen. Aviation has long recognized that by developing and maintaining a just culture through confidential reporting systems, encouraging incident reporting, and providing effective analysis and detailed output reports, safety can be improved across the global community by sharing these context-rich stories. This came about because of the analysis of cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders during detailed analysis that uncovered the fact that pilot error exposes the inherent lethality within the system. Pilots were actually keeping themselves and their passengers safe despite the flaws in the system. That same applies in diving. Divers and instructors cover the gaps in training materials, agency standards, contradictions, and equipment that is not designed with human factors principles in mind. It was the detailed sharing of those stories, including where the rules were broken, that has made aviation as safe as it is today. In the diving world, this is far from the case. There are no coherent reporting systems and blame is rife. Social media, on the one hand, is beneficial as it allows the sharing of stories, and at the same time, without an understanding of human error and human fallibility, then it is too easy to judge others about what they should have or should not have done.
I know Brian made mistakes. These mistakes, along with others, quickly and tragically became part of an error chain which resulted in his death. Human error is a very real consequence of people operating in the real world, and Brian's death is a very real example of how much the small decisions matter. Rather than running away because it's hard to talk about, I believe that sharing Brian's story, mistakes and all, we can create an opportunity for learning and teaching, empowering ourselves and others to better our diving community for the current and future generation of divers. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. I intrinsically believe that by opening communication and talking about what went wrong, we can change attitudes and find ways to do things right. I believe we, as a diving community, have a responsibility to prevent this from happening to another family, to prevent someone else from saying, "if only."